The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. At 23 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for only 8 months, but already the weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders. The tall black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, and his polished black boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Today would be different, though he didn't know it yet. Thomas had dreamed of this moment since he was a young boy growing up in a small village in Yorkshire. His grandfather had served in the Royal Regiment, and stories of honor, duty, and service filled their family dinners. The old man would sit by the fireplace, his weathered hands moving as he described the precision of ceremonial drills, the pride of protecting the monarchy, and the unbreakable bonds between soldiers who served together. When Thomas first arrived at the recruitment office in Leeds, the sergeant looked him up and down with experienced eyes. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with broad shoulders and a determined jaw, Thomas certainly looked the part. But looking the part and being the part were two very different things, as he would soon discover during the grueling months of training that followed. The training had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. Physical conditioning pushed his body to its limits, while ceremonial drill practice demanded absolute perfection in every movement. Hours were spent learning to stand motionless, regardless of weather conditions, distractions, or physical discomfort. The instructors were relentless in their pursuit of excellence, knowing that these young men would soon represent the crown itself. One particular training exercise stood out in Thomas's memory. The recruits had been ordered to stand at attention for 2 hours while instructors walked among them, trying every possible distraction. Some recruits had tourists shouting questions at them, others had people waving objects in front of their faces, and a few even had instructors making jokes or telling stories designed to break their concentration. Thomas had managed to maintain his composure throughout, earning a rare nod of approval from the drill sergeant. But today felt different as Thomas took his position outside the palace gates. The morning crowd was already gathering, a mix of tourists with cameras, local Londoners heading to work, and the occasional protester carrying signs about various political causes. The familiar weight of his rifle rested against his shoulder, and his white gloves gripped the weapon with practiced ease. The first few hours passed without incident. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed and whispered, and the usual stream of questions came his way. Where was he from? How long had he been a guard? Could he smile for just one picture? Thomas maintained his stoic expression and forward gaze, just as he had been trained to do. The red fabric of his tunic grew warm under the strengthening sun, but he remained motionless as a statue. Around midday, a group of university students approached the gates. They appeared to be on some sort of field trip, led by a professor who was explaining the historical significance of the changing of the guard ceremony. Most of the students listened politely, taking notes and asking questions about the traditions and protocols involved. Thomas could hear fragments of the conversation as they discussed the origins of the bearskin hats, the significance of the red tunics, and the role of the guards in both ceremonial and practical security functions. Among the group was a young woman with short blonde hair and bright blue eyes who seemed particularly interested in the guards themselves rather than just the ceremony. While her classmates focused on the historical facts, she watched Thomas with curious attention, noting how he maintained his position despite the growing heat of the day and the increasing number of people gathering around the gates. As the afternoon progressed, the crowds grew larger and more diverse. Street performers set up nearby, adding music and entertainment to the atmosphere around the palace. A man with a guitar sang traditional British folk songs, while a woman in colorful clothing performed magic tricks for children. The area took on a festival-like atmosphere, with vendors selling postcards, miniature guard figurines, and Union Jack flags. Thomas had learned to tune out most of the noise and activity around him, but his training also required him to remain alert to potential security threats. His eyes, though fixed forward, were constantly scanning his peripheral vision for any signs of unusual behavior or suspicious activity. The balance between ceremonial duty and practical security was one of the most challenging aspects of the job. Around 3 o'clock, a commotion began to develop near the left side of the gates. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit was arguing loudly with one of the palace security officers about something related to a meeting he claimed to have scheduled. His voice grew increasingly agitated as he insisted that he was expected inside, and that someone had made a terrible mistake. Other tourists began to gather around the argument, some taking videos with their phones. The distraction provided an opportunity for someone else in the crowd to approach Thomas's position more closely than usual. Palace security typically maintained clear boundaries around the guards, but during moments of confusion, people sometimes managed to get closer than the established protocols allowed. Thomas remained focused on his duty, maintaining his position and bearing despite the chaos developing around him. The man in the suit continued his argument, now demanding to speak with someone in higher authority about his supposed appointment. His face had turned red with frustration, and his gestures became more animated as his voice rose above the general noise of the crowd. Some tourists began to look uncomfortable, while others seemed entertained by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. It was during this moment of distraction that someone in the crowd decided to test the famous discipline of the Queen's Guard. A teenage boy, encouraged by his friends and emboldened by the general chaos, broke away from the group and approached Thomas directly. The boy's friends held up their phones, clearly recording whatever was about to happen. Thomas saw the approach from his peripheral vision, but maintained his forward gaze and rigid posture. This was exactly the type of situation his training had prepared him for. Tourists and visitors often tried various methods to get reactions from the guards, seeing it as a challenge or a game. Most attempts were harmless pranks or simple curiosity, but guards were trained to maintain their composure regardless of the provocation. The boy stopped directly in front of Thomas, close enough that he had to look up to see the guard's face beneath the bearskin hat. For several seconds, he simply stared, perhaps expecting some reaction or acknowledgement. When none came, he began to speak, asking questions in a deliberately loud voice designed to attract attention from both the guard and the surrounding crowd. Still receiving no response, the boy's behavior escalated. He began making exaggerated gestures, waving his hands in front of Thomas's face, and jumping slightly to try to enter the guard's field of vision. His friends laughed and encouraged him from behind, their phones capturing every moment of the interaction. Other tourists began to notice the scene and started gathering around to watch. The boy's attempts grew more bold as he realized he was becoming the center of attention. He started making funny faces, telling jokes, and even attempting to march in place in a mocking imitation of military drill movements. Some people in the crowd laughed at his antics, while others appeared uncomfortable with the disrespectful behavior toward the guard. Thomas remained perfectly still throughout the entire display. His training had included extensive practice in ignoring distractions, maintaining composure under pressure, and representing the dignity of the crown regardless of the circumstances. Every muscle in his body remained in perfect position, his breathing steady and controlled, his gaze fixed on the predetermined point in the distance. The situation took a more serious turn when the boy, frustrated by his complete failure to get any reaction, decided to escalate his behavior further. What had started as harmless teasing was about to cross a line that would change everything for everyone present. The crowd sensed the shift in tone, and conversations began to quiet as more people turned their attention to the unfolding drama. The boy stepped even closer to Thomas, now standing almost toe-to-toe with the guard. His friends continued recording, but some of their laughter had died away as they began to realize that their friend might be going too far. A few tourists in the crowd started to look concerned, and some parents began pulling their children away from the scene. Without warning, the boy gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at Thomas's face. The act was so sudden and unexpected that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. The spit landed on the guard's cheek, just below his left eye, and began to slowly run down toward his jaw. The boy stepped back with a smirk, clearly pleased with himself for finally doing something that the guard couldn't simply ignore. The crowd fell into a stunned silence. Even the argument with the man in the suit seemed to pause as people became aware of what had just happened. Cameras and phones continued recording, but the festive atmosphere had completely disappeared. Parents covered their children's eyes, while other tourists looked on in shock and disgust at the boy's behavior. Thomas felt the warm saliva on his face, felt it beginning to drip down his skin, but his expression never changed. His hands remained in perfect position on his rifle, his posture stayed rigid and correct, and his eyes continued to stare straight ahead. Inside, however, something was stirring. Not anger, exactly, but a deep sense of the gravity of what had just occurred. The silence that followed the spitting incident stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. Thomas could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such a blatant act of disrespect. The saliva continued its slow journey down his cheek, and he could smell the unpleasant odor, but his training held firm. Every instinct screamed at him to react, to wipe his face, to break protocol, and address the situation, but years of discipline kept him frozen in place. The teenage boy who had committed the act stood there with his arms crossed, a look of satisfied defiance on his face. His friends had stopped laughing entirely now, sensing that something significant had just happened. One of them, a girl with long brown hair, tugged at the boy's sleeve and whispered something urgent in his ear, but he shrugged her off with apparent indifference to the consequences of his actions. Among the crowd, reactions varied dramatically. Some tourists appeared genuinely horrified by what they had witnessed, while others seemed fascinated by this unexpected turn of events. A few people had their phones out, recording everything, though whether they planned to share the footage or use it as evidence was unclear. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket shook his head in disgust and muttered something under his breath about the youth today. Palace security had been dealing with the argument involving the man in the expensive suit, but the sudden change in atmosphere around Thomas's position had caught their attention. Two uniformed officers began making their way through the crowd toward the scene, though they moved carefully to avoid creating additional panic or disturbance among the tourists. The blonde university student who had been watching Thomas earlier in the day pushed through the crowd to get a better view of what was happening. Her professor tried to call the group back together, clearly uncomfortable with the situation that was developing, but several students were too fascinated by the drama to respond to his instructions. The academic discussion about ceremonial traditions had been replaced by a real-life lesson in human behavior and institutional protocol. Thomas's mind raced even as his body remained perfectly still. His training had covered many scenarios, but the specific situation of being spat upon during ceremonial duty had never been explicitly addressed. The general principle was clear: maintain composure and position regardless of provocation. But the human part of his brain struggled with the profound disrespect and humiliation of the act. The boy seemed to interpret Thomas's continued stillness as weakness or fear. He turned to his friends with a broad grin and made a gesture suggesting that he had somehow won the confrontation. This display of arrogance and lack of remorse for his actions caused several people in the crowd to react with visible anger. A middle-aged woman stepped forward and began scolding the boy loudly, telling him that his behavior was disgusting and disrespectful. More tourists began to voice their disapproval of the boy's actions. Comments in various languages filled the air as international visitors expressed their shock and dismay at what they had witnessed. Some people began taking pictures of the boy himself, perhaps thinking that public shame might serve as appropriate punishment for his behavior. The festive atmosphere that had characterized the morning had been completely destroyed. The boy's friends began to look increasingly uncomfortable as more people in the crowd turned against them. What had started as what they thought was a harmless prank had clearly crossed a line, and they were beginning to understand that there might be serious consequences for their actions. The girl who had tried to stop the boy earlier now looked genuinely frightened as she realized the gravity of the situation. Palace security officers finally reached the scene and began trying to restore order. They spoke firmly but politely to the crowd, asking people to step back and give the guard appropriate space to perform his duties. However, they also began questioning witnesses about what had happened, making it clear that the incident was being taken very seriously by the authorities. One of the security officers approached the teenage boy directly and asked for his identification. The boy's demeanor changed instantly from arrogant confidence to nervous uncertainty as he realized that he might face legal consequences for his actions. He began stammering excuses and claiming that it had all been just a joke and that no harm had been intended. The university professor finally managed to gather most of his students together and began leading them away from the scene. He had clearly decided that whatever educational value the visit might have had was now outweighed by the need to remove his charges from a potentially volatile situation. The blonde student lingered for a moment, still watching Thomas with a mixture of admiration and concern before reluctantly following her classmates. Throughout all of this, Thomas maintained his position. The saliva had dried somewhat on his cheek, leaving a visible stain on his skin, but his expression never wavered. His breathing remained controlled, his posture perfect, and his gaze fixed on the distant point that served as his focal reference. Inside, however, he was processing the situation on multiple levels. On one level, he felt a deep sense of professional pride. This was exactly the type of challenge that separated true guards from those who merely wore the uniform. His ability to maintain composure under such extreme provocation was a testament to his training and his commitment to the traditions he had sworn to uphold. Every moment he remained motionless was a victory for the discipline and professionalism of the Queen's Guard. On another level, Thomas felt the weight of representing something larger than himself. The crowd wasn't just watching Thomas Mitchell, a young man from Yorkshire. They were watching a living symbol of British tradition, military discipline, and royal protocol. His response to this situation would reflect not only on him personally, but on the entire institution he represented. The security officers continued their investigation, speaking with witnesses and taking statements about what had occurred. The boy who had committed the act was now clearly frightened and tried several times to leave the area, but the officers made it clear that he would need to remain available for questioning. His friends distanced themselves from him, perhaps hoping to avoid being associated with his actions. A senior palace official arrived on the scene, dressed in a dark suit and carrying himself with the authority that came from years of dealing with protocol and security matters. He surveyed the situation quickly, speaking briefly with the security officers and observing Thomas's continued maintenance of position despite the circumstances. His expression was serious, but not surprised. Clearly, incidents involving the guards were not entirely uncommon, though this particular level of disrespect was unusual. The crowd began to thin somewhat as some tourists decided to move on to other attractions, but many people remained, fascinated by the unfolding drama and curious to see how it would be resolved. The street performers who had been entertaining nearby had stopped their acts, recognizing that the mood of the area had shifted dramatically and that their upbeat performances were no longer appropriate. A woman with a young daughter approached one of the security officers and offered to provide a witness statement. She explained that she had seen the entire incident and was willing to testify about the boy's behavior if necessary. Her daughter, perhaps 6 years old, kept staring at Thomas with wide eyes, clearly trying to understand why the soldier man wasn't wiping his face. The investigation continued as officers gathered contact information from witnesses and documented the incident thoroughly. Photography was taken of the scene, including close-up images of the stain on Thomas's face, which would serve as evidence of what had occurred. The boy was informed that he was being detained pending further investigation and possible charges related to assault and disturbing the peace. As the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky, Thomas had been standing in position for over 7 hours, the last 30 minutes of which had been under the intense scrutiny of crowds, security officers, and media representatives who had begun to arrive as word of the incident spread. His legs ached, his back was stiff, and the dried saliva on his face had become increasingly uncomfortable, but his discipline held firm. The arrival of media representatives marked a new phase of the situation. Word had apparently spread through social media about the incident, and reporters from several local news organizations had come to investigate. They began interviewing witnesses and trying to piece together exactly what had happened, though palace security was careful to control access to both Thomas and the crime scene. The teenage boy's parents arrived, summoned by security officers who had contacted them after identifying their son. The mother appeared mortified by her son's behavior, while the father looked angry and embarrassed. They spoke briefly with the officers and then with their son, whose earlier bravado had completely disappeared as the full consequences of his actions became clear. Thomas could hear fragments of conversations around him as people discussed what they had witnessed. Many expressed admiration for his discipline and professionalism, while others debated what an appropriate response might have been. Some argued that the guard should have broken protocol to address such extreme provocation, while others insisted that his continued composure was exactly the right response. The university professor returned without his students, apparently having decided that he needed to provide a statement about what his group had witnessed. He spoke with obvious embarrassment about the incident, explaining that his students had been there for educational purposes and that none of them had been involved in the actual act of disrespect toward the guard. As the investigation continued and the crowd dynamics shifted, Thomas found himself at the center of a situation that would soon extend far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Social media posts about the incident were already beginning to circulate, and the story was taking on a life of its own as people shared their outrage about the disrespectful treatment of the guard. The blonde university student had apparently returned as well, standing at the edge of the crowd and watching the ongoing investigation with serious attention. When one of the reporters approached her for an interview about what she had witnessed, she declined politely, but continued to observe the situation with obvious concern for the guard who had maintained his position with such remarkable discipline. Palace officials were now discussing the situation among themselves, clearly trying to determine the best way to handle the incident from both a security and public relations perspective. The fact that the guard had maintained his position despite such extreme provocation was certainly a testament to the quality of training and discipline within the Queen's Guard. But it also raised questions about appropriate protocols for dealing with such situations in the future. The investigation continued for another hour while Thomas maintained his position, the dried saliva now forming a noticeable crust on his cheek that caught the light whenever he moved slightly. Palace officials had cordoned off a wider area around his post, ensuring that tourists and onlookers maintained a respectful distance while security officers completed their work. The teenage perpetrator sat on a nearby bench under guard, his earlier cockiness replaced by obvious anxiety as the reality of potential criminal charges began to sink in. News crews had multiplied as word of the incident spread across London's media networks. Television reporters stood at carefully measured distances, delivering updates to their audiences about the unprecedented act of disrespect toward a Queen's Guard and the remarkable display of military discipline in response. The story was already being framed in terms that would resonate far beyond the immediate incident, touching on themes of tradition, respect, and national pride. Thomas's commanding officer, Major Richardson, arrived in full dress uniform to assess the situation firsthand. A veteran of 23 years in the military, Richardson had dealt with numerous incidents involving his guards over the years, but nothing quite like this. He approached Thomas's position and stood slightly to the side, observing the guard's continued maintenance of perfect posture and discipline despite the extraordinary circumstances. The major made no attempt to communicate with Thomas while he was on duty, understanding that breaking the guard's concentration or compromising his position would undermine the very discipline that was being demonstrated. Instead, Richardson spoke with the senior palace official and security team leaders to understand the full scope of what had occurred and to determine the appropriate response from both a military and diplomatic perspective. Among the crowd, the incident had sparked intense discussions about respect, tradition, and appropriate behavior in public spaces. An elderly veteran approached one of the reporters and insisted on being interviewed about the significance of what the guard was demonstrating through his continued composure. "That young man," he said, pointing toward Thomas, "is showing what real discipline looks like. He's representing something bigger than himself, and he understands that." The teenage boy's parents had completed their discussions with security officials and were now dealing with the practical consequences of their son's actions. Criminal charges were being considered, including assault and public disorder offenses that could result in fines, community service, or even brief imprisonment. The family's solicitor had been contacted and was en route to provide legal advice about the situation. Social media activity around the incident continued to explode as videos and photos taken by witnesses spread across various platforms. Multiple hashtags related to the incident began trending, with people from around the world weighing in on both the disrespectful act and the guard's remarkable response. The story was taking on international dimensions as news outlets picked up the footage and commentary from social media. The blonde university student, whose name was Sarah Henderson, had positioned herself where she could observe both the ongoing official response and the guard's continued vigil. As a psychology major, she found herself fascinated by the intersection of individual discipline and institutional expectation that was playing out before her eyes. She began taking detailed notes, thinking that this real-life example might be relevant to her studies in human behavior and social psychology. Thomas could sense the increased media attention and official scrutiny, though his training prevented him from acknowledging it directly. The presence of his commanding officer nearby was both reassuring and additional pressure, as he knew his response to this situation would be evaluated not just by the public, but by his superiors within the military hierarchy. Every second he maintained his position was both a personal achievement and a reflection on the standards of the Queen's Guard. The physical discomfort of his situation was becoming more pronounced as the hours passed. The dried saliva on his face had begun to feel tight against his skin, and the psychological pressure of being the center of such intense attention was unlike anything his training had prepared him for. Yet he found strength in the knowledge that he was upholding a tradition that stretched back centuries, representing values of duty and service that transcended individual comfort or convenience. Media interviews with witnesses were revealing the wide range of reactions to both the initial incident and the guard's ongoing response. Some people expressed outrage at the disrespectful treatment and called for severe punishment of the perpetrator. Others focused on their admiration for the guard's discipline and suggested that his behavior was an inspiring example of professionalism and dedication to duty. Palace security had by now identified and interviewed most of the key witnesses to the incident. The investigation had produced a clear timeline of events and substantial evidence about what had occurred, including multiple video recordings from different angles. The case against the teenage perpetrator appeared to be straightforward, though decisions about specific charges and penalties would be made by legal authorities rather than palace officials. The university professor who had been leading the student group earlier had provided a detailed statement about the educational context of their visit and his group's observation of the incident. He expressed profound regret that what should have been a learning experience about British traditions had been marred by such disrespectful behavior, though he noted that his students had learned a powerful lesson about dignity and professional composure from watching the guard's response. As the afternoon moved toward evening, discussions began about the logistics of concluding Thomas's duty shift while preserving the dignity of the situation. Normal protocol would have called for the regular changing of the guard's ceremony, but the extraordinary circumstances required careful consideration of how to handle the transition without diminishing the impact of what had been demonstrated. Major Richardson consulted with senior palace officials about the best approach to ending Thomas's vigil in a way that honored his remarkable display of discipline while also addressing the practical needs of the situation. The decision was complicated by the presence of media and the knowledge that whatever happened next would be recorded and analyzed by audiences around the world. The teenage perpetrator's solicitor arrived and immediately began conferring with his client and the boy's parents about the legal situation. Early indications were that the authorities were treating the matter seriously, viewing it not just as a prank gone wrong but as a deliberate act of assault against a representative of the crown. The legal implications were significant and would likely extend well beyond any immediate penalties. Thomas's fellow guards, who had been monitoring the situation from their own posts around the palace grounds, felt a mixture of pride and concern for their colleagues' ordeal. They understood better than anyone the physical and mental challenges of maintaining position under normal circumstances, and could only imagine the additional pressure of doing so under such extraordinary scrutiny and provocation. The crowd dynamics had evolved throughout the day as different groups of people came and went. Early morning tourists had been replaced by lunchtime visitors, who were in turn succeeded by afternoon sightseers and now early evening observers. Each wave of new arrivals had to be briefed by others about what had happened, creating an ongoing narrative about the incident that spread far beyond those who had actually witnessed it. Sarah Henderson had remained throughout most of the day, taking breaks only when necessary, and returning to continue her observation of the situation. Her academic interest had evolved into genuine concern for the individual human being who was demonstrating such remarkable composure under pressure. She found herself wondering about the personal cost of such discipline and the psychological mechanisms that made such behavior possible. News organizations were beginning to prepare more comprehensive reports about the incident, conducting background research on the traditions and training of the Queen's Guard, and seeking expert commentary on the significance of what they had witnessed. Military historians, psychologists, and cultural commentators were being contacted for their perspectives on the broader implications of the event. The physical evidence of the assault remained visible on Thomas's face, serving as a constant reminder of what had occurred and a testament to his continued discipline in not addressing it. Photographers had documented the progression of the stain throughout the day, creating a visual record of his sustained composure in the face of such disrespect and discomfort. Palace officials were also dealing with the broader implications of the incident for security protocols and public access to the guards. While maintaining the accessibility and ceremonial nature of the guard posts was important for tourism and tradition, the incident raised questions about adequate protection for personnel who were required to remain motionless and non-responsive even when facing provocation or assault. As the day progressed toward the time when Thomas's shift would normally end, anticipation built about how the situation would be resolved. The crowd had grown larger rather than smaller as word of the ongoing vigil spread through London and beyond. People were coming specifically to witness the guard who had maintained his position for hours despite being spat upon, creating a spontaneous demonstration of public support for his discipline and professionalism. The teenage perpetrator's case was being processed through official channels, with charges being formally prepared and court dates being scheduled. The incident would clearly have lasting consequences for the young man, whose moment of poor judgment had been documented and witnessed by hundreds of people and would follow him through the legal system and beyond. Thomas himself remained focused on his duty, drawing strength from his training, his commitment to service, and the growing awareness that his response to this challenge was being watched and admired by people around the world. Each minute that passed was another testament to the values and discipline that the Queen's Guard represented, and another step toward concluding his remarkable demonstration of professional composure under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. As evening approached, the atmosphere around Thomas's position had transformed into something unprecedented in the modern history of the Queen's Guard. What had begun as a routine day of ceremonial duty had evolved into a powerful demonstration of human dignity and professional dedication that was capturing international attention. The crowd had swelled to several hundred people, many of whom had traveled specifically to witness the guard who had maintained his position for over 8 hours despite being assaulted. Major Richardson had been in constant communication with his superiors about how to handle the conclusion of this extraordinary situation. The normal changing of the guard ceremony seemed inadequate to mark the end of such a remarkable display of discipline, yet the very nature of that discipline required that any deviation from protocol be carefully considered. The decision was further complicated by the presence of international media and the knowledge that whatever happened would be recorded and broadcast worldwide. Thomas could feel his body reaching the limits of physical endurance, though his training had prepared him for extended periods of motionless duty. His legs trembled slightly from the strain of standing perfectly still for so many hours, and the muscles in his back ached from maintaining rigid posture. The dried saliva on his face had become increasingly uncomfortable, creating a constant reminder of the disrespect he had endured while simultaneously serving as evidence of his unwavering commitment to duty. The teenage perpetrator had been formally charged with assault and public disorder and had been released pending a court appearance scheduled for the following month. His parents had managed to escort him away from the scene, but not before local news cameras had captured clear images of his face. The incident would follow him for years to come, serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences of thoughtless actions and disrespectful behavior. Sarah Henderson had spent most of the day observing the situation, taking detailed notes about the crowd dynamics, media response, and the guard's remarkable composure. As a psychology student, she was particularly interested in the mechanisms that allowed someone to maintain such rigid self-control under extraordinary pressure. She had begun to see Thomas not just as a symbol of military discipline, but as an individual human being demonstrating exceptional mental strength. The international media response was growing beyond anything palace officials had anticipated. News organizations from around the world were picking up the story, framing it in terms of their own cultural values and national perspectives on respect, tradition, and individual dignity. Social media engagement was reaching viral levels, with millions of people sharing videos, photos, and commentary about both the initial assault and the guard's ongoing response. Among the crowd, spontaneous expressions of support for Thomas had begun to emerge. Some people had started a slow, respectful clap that gradually spread through the gathered observers. Others held up signs expressing admiration for his discipline and condemnation of the disrespectful treatment he had received. A group of military veterans had positioned themselves prominently in the crowd, standing at attention in solidarity with the young guard. The economic impact of the incident was also becoming apparent as tourism numbers around Buckingham Palace spiked dramatically. Hotels in the area reported sudden increases in bookings from people who wanted to witness the scene firsthand, while local businesses experienced unexpected crowds as visitors came to see the location where such a remarkable display of discipline was taking place. Thomas's family in Yorkshire had learned about the situation through news reports and social media coverage. His parents, both teachers, felt a mixture of pride and worry as they watched their son become the center of international attention. His grandfather, the former Royal Regiment veteran who had inspired Thomas's military ambitions, declared that his grandson was upholding the finest traditions of British military service. Palace security had implemented additional crowd control measures as the number of observers continued to grow. Barriers were erected to maintain appropriate distances while still allowing people to witness the ongoing demonstration of duty and discipline. The ceremonial nature of the guard's post was being balanced against practical security concerns and the need to manage the unprecedented public interest in the situation. The investigation into the assault had been completed, with officers gathering substantial evidence, including multiple video recordings from different angles, witness statements from dozens of observers, and photographic documentation of the physical evidence on the guard's face. The case would proceed through the legal system as a clear example of assault against a representative of the Crown, carrying potentially serious consequences. Expert commentators were beginning to appear on news programs to discuss the broader significance of what was happening. Military historians spoke about the traditions and training that made such discipline possible, while psychologists analyzed the mental and emotional strength required to maintain composure under such circumstances. Cultural commentators discussed the incident in terms of respect for tradition and appropriate behavior in public spaces. The teenage boys' school had been contacted by media organizations seeking comment about one of their students being involved in such a high-profile incident. The headmaster issued a brief statement expressing disappointment in the student's behavior and emphasizing that such actions did not represent the values or standards expected of pupils at their institution. The incident was likely to have lasting consequences for the boys' educational and future employment prospects. Thomas's commanding officers were conducting their own review of the situation, both to ensure that proper protocols had been followed and to document the exemplary behavior demonstrated under extraordinary circumstances. His response to the assault would likely be noted in his permanent military record as an example of exceptional dedication to duty and maintenance of professional standards under pressure. The crowd had developed its own informal leadership as people who had been present for longer periods helped newcomers understand what had happened and the significance of what they were witnessing. Stories about the initial assault and the guard's unwavering response were being shared throughout the gathering, creating a shared narrative about dignity, respect, and the proper response to provocation. Religious leaders from various faiths had begun commenting on the spiritual dimensions of what they saw as a demonstration of forgiveness, self-control, and commitment to higher principles. Some drew parallels to religious teachings about turning the other cheek and responding to hatred with dignity, while others focused on the discipline and self-sacrifice required to serve others even when facing personal humiliation. The university group that had been present during the initial incident had become minor celebrities in their own right, as their professor and several students were interviewed by media outlets seeking first-hand accounts of what had happened. The professor used the opportunity to discuss the educational value of witnessing such a powerful example of character and professional commitment in action. Local government officials had also begun weighing in on the situation, with the mayor of London issuing a statement commending the guard's exemplary conduct and condemning the disrespectful behavior that had precipitated the incident. Members of Parliament were being asked for their perspectives on the broader issues of respect for national institutions and appropriate public behavior. Thomas could sense the growing crowd and increased activity around his position, though his training prevented him from acknowledging it directly. The knowledge that so many people had come to witness his commitment to duty provided both encouragement and additional pressure to maintain the standards he had upheld throughout this extraordinary day. Every minute that passed was another demonstration of the values and principles that defined his service. The physical challenges of his extended vigil were mounting as the hours passed. Dehydration was becoming a concern, though guards were trained to manage extended periods without water breaks. The psychological pressure of being the focus of such intense international attention was unlike anything covered in his training, yet he found strength in the knowledge that he was representing something larger than himself. International diplomatic observers were also taking note of the incident, seeing in it a reflection of British values and institutional stability that had implications beyond the immediate situation. The guard's response was being interpreted as a demonstration of the kind of character and discipline that underpinned Britain's democratic institutions and cultural traditions. The queue of people waiting to observe the scene had grown so long that it extended several blocks from the palace gates. Street vendors had appeared selling refreshments to the waiting crowds, while local authorities worked to manage traffic flow and ensure public safety. What had begun as a routine day at one of London's most popular tourist attractions had become an impromptu demonstration of human dignity that was drawing visitors from across the city and beyond. As the time approached when Thomas's shift would normally end, speculation grew about how the situation would be concluded. The traditional changing of the guard ceremony seemed insufficient to mark the end of such an extraordinary demonstration, Yet any deviation from established protocol would need to respect both the dignity of the occasion and the military traditions that had made such discipline possible in the first place. The moment of conclusion arrived as the sun began to set over London, casting long shadows across the palace grounds where Thomas had maintained his vigil for nearly 9 hours. Major Richardson, in consultation with senior palace officials and military command, had made the decision to conclude the guard's duty with a ceremony that would honor both his extraordinary discipline and the traditions he had so remarkably upheld throughout this unprecedented day. A formal honor guard consisting of Thomas's fellow Queen's Guards marched into position with precision timing that had been rehearsed countless times, but never under such extraordinary circumstances. The crowd fell silent as they recognized that they were about to witness something significant. Media cameras focused intently on the scene, understanding that they were documenting the conclusion of what had become an international story about dignity, duty, and human character. The relief guard approached Thomas's position with slow, measured steps that emphasized the solemnity of the moment. As his replacement took position beside him, Thomas finally, after 9 hours of unwavering stillness, moved. The simple act of stepping aside felt almost surreal after such an extended period of motionless duty, and the crowd responded with spontaneous applause that built into sustained ovation lasting several minutes. Major Richardson stepped forward and, in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, addressed both Thomas and the gathered crowd. "Guardsman Mitchell," he said, "your conduct today has exemplified the highest traditions of the Queen's Guard and the British Army. Your discipline, professionalism, and dignity under extraordinary circumstances have honored both your uniform and your country." Thomas saluted sharply, his movements crisp despite the physical exhaustion that must have been overwhelming after his extended vigil. The simple military gesture carried profound meaning after the hours of enforced stillness, representing both the conclusion of his duty and his continued commitment to the standards he had demonstrated. The dried saliva on his face remained visible, serving as lasting evidence of both the disrespect he had endured and the composure with which he had responded. The crowd's applause continued as Thomas was escorted away from his post for the first time in 9 hours. Many people were visibly emotional as they witnessed the conclusion of what they had come to see as a powerful demonstration of human dignity and professional commitment. Some spectators were openly weeping, moved by what they had witnessed and the knowledge that they had been present for something truly extraordinary. Sarah Henderson, the psychology student who had observed much of the day's events, found herself profoundly affected by what she had witnessed. As she watched Thomas finally leave his post, she realized that she had observed not just an example of military discipline, but a demonstration of human character that would influence her understanding of psychology, resilience, and the capacity for individuals to transcend difficult circumstances through commitment to higher principles. The immediate aftermath of the incident saw Thomas taken to a private area where he could finally address his basic physical needs after the extended period of duty. Medical personnel were standing by to ensure that his health had not been compromised by the extraordinary demands of his vigil, while military counselors were available to help him process the psychological impact of becoming the center of such intense international attention. The teenage perpetrator, meanwhile, was facing the beginning of a legal process that would have lasting consequences for his future. The charges against him were serious, and the high-profile nature of the incident meant that his case would be closely watched by media and legal observers. His brief moment of poor judgment had resulted in a situation that would affect him for years to come, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of respectful behavior and consideration for others. News reports about the incident were already being broadcast around the world, with different media outlets focusing on various aspects of the story. Some emphasized the disrespectful assault on the guard, while others highlighted his remarkable response and what it revealed about military training and personal character. The story was being interpreted through different cultural lenses, but the universal themes of dignity and professionalism resonated across international boundaries. Social media activity reached unprecedented levels as the conclusion of Thomas's vigil was shared instantly across multiple platforms. Videos of his final salute and the crowd's response were viewed millions of times within hours, accompanied by commentary from people around the world expressing admiration for his conduct and outrage at the treatment he had received. The hashtags related to the incident continued trending globally, making it one of the most discussed events of the day. The impact on tourism was immediate and substantial, with Buckingham Palace experiencing record visitor numbers in the days following the incident. People came from around the world to see the location where such a remarkable demonstration of duty and dignity had taken place. Hotels, restaurants, and local businesses reported significant increases in activity as the area became a destination for those seeking to understand and honor what had occurred. Thomas's family in Yorkshire was overwhelmed by the attention their son's conduct had generated. Messages of support poured in from around the world, while media outlets sought interviews about his background and upbringing. His grandfather, the former Royal Regiment veteran who had inspired Thomas's military career, became a frequent spokesperson for the family, expressing pride in his grandson's conduct while emphasizing that it reflected the values and training common to all Queen's Guards. The incident prompted broader discussions about respect for public servants, appropriate behavior in public spaces, and the role of traditional institutions in modern society. Educational institutions began using the story as a teaching tool for discussions about character, professionalism, and response to adversity. Military academies around the world incorporated the incident into their training programs as an example of exceptional discipline under pressure. Palace officials conducted a comprehensive review of security protocols and public access policies in light of the incident. While maintaining the traditional accessibility of the Queen's Guard remained important for both ceremonial purposes and public engagement, measures were implemented to better protect guards from similar incidents while preserving the essential character of their public role. The legal proceedings against the teenage perpetrator moved forward through the British court system, with the case becoming a closely watched example of consequences for disrespectful and assaultive behavior. The young man's conviction on charges of assault and public disorder resulted in a sentence that included both financial penalties and community service, along with a requirement to write a formal letter of apology that was later published in national newspapers. Thomas returned to regular duty with the Queen's Guard, though his life had been permanently changed by his response to that extraordinary day. He received numerous awards and commendations for his conduct, including recognition from senior military officials and civilian authorities. More importantly, he had become a living example of the values and principles that define professional service and human dignity under pressure. The psychological impact of the incident extended far beyond those directly involved, as people around the world found inspiration in Thomas's example of maintaining composure and dignity despite provocation and disrespect. His response became a reference point for discussions about appropriate behavior, professional standards, and the power of individual character to influence others through positive example. Years later, the incident continued to be remembered and discussed as an example of exceptional conduct under extraordinary circumstances. Thomas Mitchell's name became synonymous with professional discipline and human dignity, while his response to being spat upon while on duty was studied in military academies, business schools, and psychology programs as an example of grace under pressure. The teenage boy who had committed the assault eventually completed his community service and legal obligations, but the incident followed him throughout his adult life as a reminder of the consequences of disrespectful behavior. He later wrote publicly about the experience, expressing genuine remorse for his actions and admiration for the guard's response, acknowledging that he had learned important lessons about respect, dignity, and the impact of individual choices on others. Sarah Henderson completed her psychology degree and went on to conduct research into resilience and human behavior under stress, frequently referencing what she had witnessed that day at Buckingham Palace as a formative experience in understanding the capacity for individuals to transcend difficult circumstances through commitment to higher principles and professional standards. The incident ultimately became more than just a story about one guard's remarkable discipline. It became a testament to the power of individual character to inspire others and demonstrate the values of duty, service, and dignity that transcend cultural and national boundaries. Thomas Mitchell's response to being spat upon while on duty had stunned a crowd, captured international attention, and provided a lasting example of how to maintain one's principles and professionalism even in the face of the most challenging and disrespectful treatment. The legacy of that extraordinary day continued to influence people around the world, serving as a reminder that true strength lies not in retaliation or emotional response to provocation, but in the quiet dignity of maintaining one's standards and commitment to duty regardless of how others choose to behave. In maintaining his position and his silence, Thomas Mitchell had spoken more powerfully than any words could have conveyed about the values that defined not just military service, but human character itself.